Welcome to the audience here in the room and on Zoom, and also to family and friends. And we will have a special event today, and MacKinnon will present her new book on public waters. And if you see, there are also T-shirts about it. So, Anne has been trained as a journalist and holds also a law degree from Berkeley. And by investigating stories actually about her history of the coal industry, she made her way from Kentucky to Wyoming, where she's now living since almost 40 years, I guess. She also became an editor-in-chief of a statewide newspaper in Wyoming, and afterwards she helped found and direct the online in-depth news site Wyofile.com, so that's why we like to call her a journalist. She came to the Ostrom Workshop in 2005 as a visiting scholar, so at the same time when I was first time here. And after becoming really fascinated with water governance rules in Wyoming and how they might impact on the whole Midwest, and being interested in the history of this water governance, and she first met Mike McGinnis. I don't know if you are, Mike, already in the audience, but she wanted to know if it's worthwhile to write a book about that. And I think you got good feedback, and that's why you stayed as a visiting scholar. And became increasingly more interested in basic questions of human behavior, so how societies behave in arid places, and how they manage their water resources, particularly if water scarcity is foreseen in the future. So we met at that time, and I convinced her a little bit to include a PhD in resource economics on her way to writing her initial initiative of that book. So it has been an interesting challenge, I suppose, to deepen her theoretical and conceptual knowledge, but at the same time, organized skills and family care and traveling planning between the US and Germany at that time. And she finalized her PhD in 2014, and Bill, you have been one of her committee members, if I recall correctly. So since I know her, she tracked and joined the work of state and tribal boards governing water all over the state, and she served 8 years in the Wyoming Water Development Commission. I'm convinced nobody in the state follows the history of decision-making and arguing so closely and constantly as Anne. So it's really a gift that she managed to download all her insights in a book at hand in such an accessible way. She has recently helped to facilitate a couple of important water governance processes, like the one on the Cholera River, where 7 states are trying to reduce each other's water consumption. And as I learned just last week, you got a new appointment to help negotiating groundwater management between the city of Laramie and the surrounding counties, so 2 different governments under the pressure of economic growth and building houses with septic tanks, but at the same time that might impact groundwater resources where the city depends on for drinking water. So with saying that, I would also like to introduce not only Anne, but this new format at the Ostrom Workshop, which we like to call impact stories. So we would actually like to know how Anne did benefit from her time as a visiting scholar at the workshop and the intellectual, I hope so, engagement with other scholars from the workshop at follow-up stays, like also the workshop on the workshop, or becoming a member of the International Association for the Study of the Commons. So if so, how did it impact the daily work, as we just learned what we call the practitioner, not only as a journalist, but more as being an advisor to water administrations at various levels. So particularly today, we are interested to know more about the content of that book for sure, but also how do you manage to write up this history of water governance in such an accessible way, not for academia, but for the general audience? And what does this day at the workshop help you in maybe outlining structure for the book or bringing up certain thoughts in it? So let me also welcome Bill Blomqvist as a water policy and governance expert, and also my predecessor of the Commons Governance Program Director here at the workshop. Bill dedicated much of his academic attention to water management aspects in the US West. He did his PhD, as some of you might know, together with or under the supervision with Lynn, finalized that in 1987, and already at that time also at water governance issues in California, but also in the US. And since then has always been a strong ties with the Ostrom Workshop. He helped also a lot in transforming the workshop to its current structure. He serves on the editorial board of the Policy Study Journal and has been associate editor of the Water Resource Research. And after working for the IUPOI, where he has been a professor of political science and served as a dean for the School of Liberal Arts, he seemed not to want to retire that summer. So he's now a visiting professor at Baldus University. He's also a senior fellow at the Ostrom Workshop and an active member of the Polycentricity Working Group. So I know that Bill and Anne talked a lot in the last 15 years about the process of how this book develops and many thoughts in it. And I'm extremely pleased that, Bill, you could make it today to discuss with us this important outcome of your visiting scholar stay. So we are happy to listen to your talk and then it's time for questions.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share the screen effectively.
Yeah. Who's that?
And then,
I won't be here tomorrow.
Oh, you won't be here tomorrow, okay. See you next week.
See you next week.
what do we hear? Is that David? Yeah, so David, you need to mute. Now I should be able to just turn this into a slideshow, but I can't see. Is it way up here? That?
Yeah, it's behind.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's in the lower right corner. There you go. So the little thing that looks like a projector to the left of the.
I can't even see that.
All right. Let's see if I can.
David, mute your person. We can hear you up there.
Now you're in business.
Great, all right. So, and then do I just need to, well, anyway. Fine.
That will stay there.
Okay, yeah.
Just stuck with it.
So yeah, I wanted to give a sense of both why and how I did this study, and particularly what the workshop meant to me, which was huge. If any of you were here for the earlier discussion at noon, which was about Eric's book, about Lynn and her work, again, written for a non-technical audience. This is non-technical audience day. And I think it's extremely important to try to get an understanding of all the kinds of work on governance out to more people to help them act. And that was the reason I worked on this book, was to try to get people in Wyoming to understand their own system in a way that could allow them to act to change it and to really work with it, because a lot of times, well, as I'll describe, they didn't really understand how it worked. Now I'll see if I can make, yes, there we are. Okay, so my own story was moving from a place like Bloomington to a place that looked like this. I was, as Insa said, I was following coal industry issues and trying to understand what would happen to a rural place that went through major industrial development with coal mining in the 1970s, which had also happened in Kentucky and West Virginia, where I used to live, and had been pretty much of a disaster there. So my question as I moved there was, would this place do better? But I found myself increasingly interested in water because there were, I would cover the legislature and people were just very quiet and respectful when somebody called the state engineer walked into the room. And so I wondered who that was. And then there was also big litigation was starting to happen that was clearly going to be over hundreds of millions of dollars spent by Nebraska and Wyoming, fighting over what is the North Platte River, but to my eyes, it goes right through the town I was living in, looked like what we called Beargrass Creek in Kentucky. So I thought, so what's going on here? So as it turns out, my experience moving from a place like Bloomington to a place like this is exactly what happened to the European pioneers who moved out there. And so they, who had been mostly dealing with problems of too much water, had to figure out, okay, what's going on? What do we do now with this? So they came up with some locally developed rules. And this is very much a short version of those rules, of course. Prior appropriation allocates risk so that the first comers in times of shortage, they take all the water, whether or not anybody subsequent to that. First comers meaning that they have established a right at some point. In Wyoming, that means if the right you now have was established by somebody before 1910. And after that, you don't have a very high priority. You may still get water in ordinary times, but in drought times, less. The first comers get it, or their heirs, or the people who followed them and received that land and water. Interestingly, there was, and I was, the discussion that Eric had about Valencia, for instance. Well, there was a young man who came to Wyoming at about 28. He was hired to try to do a better job figuring out water management in 1888. And one of the things he had done was read all about European water management, including Valencia. And he was very impressed with the idea of those water courts. So this prior appropriation thing was sort of already there. So he didn't try to rip out that tradition. But he put on top of it the idea that it had to be state authorization. We will inspect to see whether you are really using that water. Are you really the first comer? Is that date correct? All that kind of stuff. And so that's this two key prongs of the system. And I can tell you more about the rules if you want to know. But one of the things that's worth knowing as economists is there was never any price for water, although this guy, whose name was Elwood Mead, thought that at some point, he wrote in his reports to the state people that at some point, I'm sure that you will all agree to pay rent for water, because that's really, that creates a structure that helps you understand that the state and the public are really the owners of this water and are generously liable. Of course, that has never happened. The users were like, whoa. I mean, I don't even think they ever thought about it. But at this point, if you propose that, a small revolution and you would be hung. So I came, Mike McGinnis, I came to visit the workshop in the summer. A family friend had told me, I'd read Ostrom, but I had no idea that she was in Indiana. I thought, the word Ostrom sounded like Denmark to me. So this guy said, no, you could go to Indiana. So I came in the summer and met Mike, who was here. Of course, Lynn and Vincent were not here. And he said, yeah, I think maybe you could be a visiting scholar. And when I did come, I met Bill and he read my first draft of my first chapter. I don't know if you remember doing that, but he said, oh yeah, I think maybe you got something. Yeah, I think. And that made me feel like, maybe among all these scholars, I could sort of make my way. And what I found most useful was thinking about the types of rights that you're also familiar with. And I tracked it because I had already been thinking about over time who was doing what and how were the rules changing. and realized that the users pretty much have the access and withdrawal rights, and sometimes the management rights and some kinds of management rights, and it's changed over time. And then the administrators who are representing the public, and I don't use the word the state there because Vincent taught me never to use it, never say that. Although I do it in the book for ordinary readers because that's how they think of it, state as in the state government. They have the exclusion and alienation rights, but often sometimes the management rights too. And so that I couldn't get the arrow to suggest to you. But anyway, the management rights sort of have shifted back and forth over time. And I was able to track that. The other thing that I found really helpful was to think about constitutional choice. And I realized as I looked at, so I was, as a researcher, I was trying to understand the rules and where they came from and how they changed over time. And it became really apparent that although the legislature may think now that they are in charge of these rules, they never have been. And I don't think they will be, because it's the users and administrators who work things out over time about alienation, for instance, definitely about management. They have set the operational rules. And then when they get to a point where they feel that perhaps these need to be more generally known outside their own circle, and I did a lot of reading and sort of legal theory about how that gets to be the case. Anyway, then they would tell the legislature what they should put in the statutes. And as I observed, just as a reporter, the legislature was like, oh, yeah, what do you want? Oh, yeah, okay. So, so that is really how it works. And although clearly water, it's mostly surface water that's used in this state, although I am about to launch on a water thing, but it's obviously a common pool resource, but it's not a commons management. It's not commons governance. But over time, I began to think, and this is while I was working in Germany and talking to Konrad Hagedorn, who had been here also as a visiting scholar, that talking about it as a community management system, a community governance. And of course, some people have said to me, oh, well, you know, it's just administrative capture. These users have just captured these guys. But I don't really think that's true because as I say, I've watched it over time. The administrators have, you know, sometimes when that's happened, they fought back. And really it is, and they know each other. So let me see if I have, yeah. So one example Insa and I worked on, which was quite recent, and this is a management change. You can imagine from the 1880s that the only good thing to use water for was either agriculture, irrigation, or a power plant, you know, some economic use. But over time, of course, the society has begun to think there might be other things like, could we preserve the bird habitat, which in this case was in Nebraska, downstream on this North Platte River that looked like a creek to me when I first came here. So these are sandhill cranes, but there also are a number of three other, anyway, that are endangered species of bird and one endangered species of fish. So federal law comes into play and an elaborate process happened, but ultimately Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado, which also has the headwaters of another part of this river, had to agree on how they were going to try to sustain this habitat, even though none of them had ever believed that water should be used for any such thing. So what happened in Wyoming was almost a sleight of hand. The state figured out that, oh, we have this big federal reservoir on the river that's been there 100 years, and so it's lost a lot of space to sediment. So we could put a little dam on top of that dam to expand it and say that this new water is the same date in the system as we're just recreating what was lost to sediment. So this will have the date of the original dam, which was 1904, which, as I say, is, you know, a good date in Wyoming. And the birds can have a chunk of that water. So essentially, they said, and this is how Insa and I wrote about it for ecological economics for the journal, they gave birds a date. Now, it's possible that the birds were using this habitat before 1904, I think we all agree. But this was, people were able to accept this. I went around and did some interviews, just really, well, a little bit on other topics, but particularly on this topic. And here are the guys who are, this system is really for, and who, you know, it's responded to their needs over time. The water user, this guy is also a state senator, and the administrators, and you can see it's not too easy to tell them all apart. So what we found in the interviews I did, that people accepted this because they really like this prior appropriation system with the dates, because it goes with their mental model of the whole story of their place. Pioneers came here, they deserve to have the rights, they struggled, blood, sweat, and tears. We believe in the system because we see these guys every day. There's not a big elaborate power structure, it's pretty flat. So it's not like, you know, where nobody's out there trying to make it really change, and we're all invested in it. So they all, every person I interviewed said, oh yeah, this plat thing, that makes perfect sense. You know, now the birds have a date of 1904 and they fit into our understanding of dates, and man. So that was pretty interesting to see happen, because I mean, this is also a place where there was a huge fight over getting any kind of water rights for fish who, you know, need water. And there was a friend of mine used to describe the head of the agriculture committee. No, anyway, he was a major irrigator in the legislature, stood up and said, "We're going to do this for fish, for fish." And, you know, so they did a very narrow thing for fish. That was before this thing with the birds. But generally, the idea that you're going to use water for anything other than this guy and his tractor in that ditch is not very welcome. But then the question is that really enough? And this is the question that Bill on my committee asked. So I was describing, you know, so it's a responsive system that learns from change. There's a lot of communication between the users and the administrators. And he said, yeah, right, okay. That's all necessary conditions for resilience, which is what I was sort of about, is this system going to last? It's necessary, but is it sufficient? And I wasn't very able to answer that very well in my PhD presentation. But that's what I've thought about since then. And this book is, you know, some years later. So one of the interesting there's still, can we allow water to be used for non-simple economic purposes is still a contested issue. But more and more people are interested in it. But the other more pressing issue, I think, is they were willing to give a date to birds, but to 2 Indian tribes who live on a reservation in the state, nah. So what happened with, these are 2 guys that I wish I could, maybe I can move this little.
You can.
Yeah.
Move it on the other side.
They can't see it anyway.
Oh, they can't. Okay, fine. So these people, through some federal government manipulations, were forced to sell a good deal of the reservation that they had signed up, that they'd signed a treaty for in 1868. And they did, this is the old best photo I could find from the 19-teens. They worked on creating their own irrigation system at the instruction of the federal guys who were running the reservation, who also instructed them to sell more land to be able to buy these horses, to be able to, and so on. There is federal law that says you have a water right dated from your reservation date, but that was not recognized in this state until there were some early cases recognizing it, and then they were kind of buried. And then it finally, in 1989, the state Supreme Court recognized that the people living on this reservation, which has a lot of wonderful resources, had a right dated 1868, which is before any of these Wyoming rights. But when this is a father and son, and the guy in black on the right, his name is Dick Baldus, was the head of the local US Fish and Wildlife Service office. So he had a degree in fisheries management, a master's, and he ran a federal office. And the tribes, with his leadership, wanted to create and make it possible for water to actually run all the way down this river through the reservation, which it was not doing because there were big federal irrigation projects built by the feds for non-Indian irrigators who were taking a lot of the water. So the tribes went ahead and said, under our own code, now that we have this water right, we'll make what we call an in-stream flow right. And the state said, oh, no. And it went to the Supreme Court again. And in that case, the Supreme Court said, oh, well, you may have a water right, but you have to follow state rules. So it's like, what? So this guy's son, his name is Jason, was about 10 when his father was working on all this stuff. He is now with the National Wildlife Federation introducing bison back onto the reservation and working with people on a little group of people who are trying to figure out how we're going to go at that again and win this time, possibly because some of the major players have died. So it's possible who were, really at odds in the last time. So we think we can get a negotiated agreement that may end up in some change.
And can I break in with a question?
Yeah.
So when the Supreme Court held that they still have to follow state rules, why didn't they appeal that case to the US Supreme Court?
That's a great question. So there was, it was sort of two different reasons. One of them was this had taken, the lawsuit was originally filed by the state against the tribes in 1976. So there was a lot of exhaustion, political, economic, trust, energy, money within the tribe. And there are two tribes, so they don't always agree. And so that was part of it, but also there was considerable doubt by that time whether or not what the Supreme Court would do, the US Supreme Court. Partly because on the earlier case, the sort of initial decision, Sandra Day O'Connor was on the court. She recused herself because at the last minute, it turned out that her ranch in Arizona was getting in a dispute with tribes there. So she recused herself. But before that, she had circulated, as they circulate their thoughts, she had circulated saying, this will do so much damage to these white irrigator operations that have been supported by the federal government. I don't know. Really. And so she didn't have a voice in that because she recused herself. But they were quite worried that if the court upheld what the state had said, it would affect tribes all over the country. Whereas if they just took it.
It would also affect federally reserved water rights.
Oh, yes, that's what I mean.
So why
Federally
would the
reserved
federal government be interested in overfiling in the Supreme Court?
Yeah, no, I think the feds would have supported them. But if the court had decided against it, it would be a major change in federal reserve water right law and affect tribes all over this country. So they basically took it in the stomach and just went, boo. But as I say, we're hoping that it'll be possible to not talk to the courts again, and just because there are a number of reasons why it can potentially work, and part of it is that some of the players are gone. So anyway, that those questions to me, is sort of the ongoing question is, okay, here we have a system that has shown itself responsive to at least one group of people. But, things are changing so much now. Here we have technology. This is for water sprinklers that are there for, this is my last slide. That that it's changing the hydrology itself, this amount of using water. Sometimes it's surface water, these sprinklers, but still it changes how the water moves through the system. A lot more people in the state, not just out of state, really caring about keeping water in streams. Here we have these guys who are a pretty active pair, and they got ideas. So the state, the society is changing, but water management, if you even think about the concrete and everything involved in it, is definitely a slow variable. And so is there enough communication? How well does that happen within a system is a question I'm hoping to be able to say, yes, in this system, we're gonna make that happen, but we'll see. And so I wrote this book really to reach people in the state and also in the West to say water law is not fixed in stone. People treat it like in our state, like tablets handed down from Moses. Okay, this is not the case. It has changed over time. You can be proud of how it's changed over time, and it is going to keep changing. And that these are public waters. If we get time, I'll read you a quote from this 28-year-old Elwood writing about how you cannot give people private perpetual rights. This is a resource that, I mean, he didn't say common pool resource, but okay, it's a resource on which the public's welfare will depend. And then also I felt it was really important to say there are a lot of wonderful young people who are increasingly involved in water management issues in the West. And a lot of young women, and there weren't, 40 years ago, the meetings were all men. But I also hear people saying, yeah, well, that's a stupid rule. Let's get rid of that. And so, okay, it may not have effects that you like, but you ought to know how that rule got there, why it's there, how stupid is it really, and then help people build on their tradition to make a change if there needs to be a change. That you really, particularly this incremental stuff we talked about, we all know issues about path dependency, how to get people to make that change. You need to know their history so that you can speak to them about where it all came from and with an understanding of the blood, sweat, and tears part that created the system. And so, yeah, I'm beginning to see people referring to it. And there's a new state engineer who said to me, yeah, so I read your book and I'm thinking about those three things. And I think I represent the public. And I'm kind of like, all right, because I've had, long ago, one of the administrators said to me, I said something about, they have to consider public interest. And he said, that's not true. We don't have to do that. It's in the state constitution. And he didn't know it. So anyway, so thank you all. It's a pleasure. And I hope Bill is going to jump in.
You stop sharing screen?
Yes,
And I
let me
can
see if I can do that.
Yeah.
Pull them down.
Okay.
Pull that little bar over there.
Oh, there,
And
and
go
stop.
there. It
The
stops
red.
here, the red.
Okay.
Okay.
There you go.
You can,
Welcome
wanna
back,
do that?
everybody.
Yeah, maybe I don't need for now. I don't know, maybe Bill, do you want to come in with
Maybe
some
just, what I'd like to do is just pick up from some of what Ann has said today, but also what Ann has written in this book, because the theme of the book, as she touched on just now, is the importance of a rule laid down a long time ago that water in Wyoming, and this is true in some other Western states as well, that water in Wyoming belongs to the public. Private individuals, companies, organizations can use it, but it's not theirs. And that fundamental constitutional rule has shaped how water law and policy and use and management have evolved in Wyoming ever since. So that's a theme of the book. It's terribly important. And I just want to say two things about it and then get other people into the conversation. The first thing I want to say about it that is also clear from some of the illustrations that Anne was providing is that water may belong to the public, but the public isn't a thing. The public is multiple communities. And so there are farmers and they're part of the public. And there are tribes who it took a long time to figure this out, but they're part of the public too.
Mhm.
And there's municipalities and they're part of the public. And there are environmental conservationists and they're part of the public and so forth. So simultaneously with the fact that the constitutional rule that the water belongs to the public is a terribly important principle, it also ends up being the beginning and not the end of the story. Because water belonging to the public then just gets you into this whole other set of questions like, well, what does that mean? And aren't I part of the public too? And so if I'm part of the public too, then shouldn't the water be doing what I want the water to do and so forth? So whole rafts of political conflict ensue. But the other thing I wanted to say, because I'm seeing it all over the place, is that the property rules that evolved in the late 19th and early 20th centuries around water, around the use of water, have kind of gotten us stuck in the West, especially the rule of seniority and prior appropriation doctrine that Anne mentioned. And what seems to be happening now, how much it's happening in Wyoming, I'd obviously defer to you. You follow that and you know it. But what seems to be happening in some other places too is a kind of recognition that the property rules aren't working very well for the current circumstances. And so what people are starting to do in various places in various ways is they're finding their way back to that constitutional principle. And usually alongside the water belongs to the public, in most Western state constitutions that have language like that, it'll say water belongs to the public and is supposed to be put to reasonable and beneficial use or put to maximum reasonable and beneficial use and so forth. And some language like that is either before or after the water belongs to the public language. And that becomes or is becoming the principle to which people are returning as they're trying to figure out whether they can modify the property rules around water. What is it, what does it mean in 2021? To say the water belongs to the public? What does a reasonable and beneficial use of water mean in 2021? Which includes things like what counts as waste of water. When people started proposing that there should be, God forbid, in-stream flow rights, that water should be left in the stream.
That's waste.
That's waste, right? I mean, because that's water for crying out loud, and we can do stuff with it and get it out of there and put it on the land and grow stuff. And so what counted as waste was not using it. In a coastal state like a California or Oregon or Washington, what counts is letting it flow to the ocean. Oh, for God's sake. I mean, that's perfectly good water.
Right.
You're gonna let it flow out to the ocean and become salt water? You can't do anything with that. That's waste. Get every drop out of that stream before it hits, before it hits the shoreline. What is changing is the sense of what it counts to wastewater. Some of those things that stood as wasteful uses 20, 30, 40 years ago are not necessarily seen as waste, or at least it's contestable now.
Yeah.
And new questions are arising like, well, does applying large amounts of water to grow a low value crop constitute a waste of water? And the property rules, which tend to be either judicially crafted or some cases statutorily crafted. I mean, sometimes it's legislative, sometimes it's the accretion of court decisions over time. But that body of property rules has shown for many years its brittleness, its lack of resilience. And what people are trying to do, it seems to me, is stop short of just throwing those property rules out, because that's A, hard, and B, scary. So instead, trying to find a way to modify them, curtail them, shave them a little bit here, stretch them a little bit there, around the bedrock principle of it's the public's water, and it's to be put to reasonable and beneficial use and not wasted. It's just that now we talk about reasonable beneficial use and waste, and we talk about them sort of differently than we did a generation ago. So I just wanted to sort of start with those two thoughts, and that's it. And I am super happy to be here on non-technical book day because I'm all for it. And so thanks for doing this book.
Yeah.
And thanks for making it a great read. And we need to have more journalists who get PhDs and then actually know how to write stuff that people want to read. So thank you.
Well, thank you. You know, we're such a major encourager. When you said, oh, I think you got something here, I felt like, oh, okay. Oh, you know, so it made a big difference. So when you mentioned that, and I didn't say this as I was trying to kind of rush through, but when I was first sort of getting introducing myself to all of this stuff, the first thing I saw was that rigid reaction. So in the 1980s, there was this water for fish. And there was also
not no, but hell no.
Yeah, and there was also those goddamn tribes. I mean, that's all you saw. And it was reflected both in the extreme crabbed narrowness of the in-stream flow bill that they did pass, and the way the Supreme Court reacted, which was, oh, well, it's your water, but you can't actually do anything with it that you want to do. Because, yeah, in-stream for fish, I mean, it went back to the for fish. And there were all kinds of ins and outs that sort of demonstrated that more. But what I feel like I've seen, and I have a Pollyanna streak, so this may not really be the case, but what I've seen since then is what you're saying, you know, that okay, this rigid response, we can get away from that. And interestingly, when I was interviewing some tribal members, a guy that's been in the tribal water office for a long time, and I was asking, you know, so what do you think about and I'd just been reading Panarchy, and I said, so what do you think about their system? You know, and he said, it's rigid. And I thought, oh yeah, page 234 of, you know, Panarchy, right there, rigid response. And but anyway, I think it is changing. I mean, people, you know, you got all kinds of ranchers in this case who are trying to get water to flow through their places because they can have fishermen or because they personally like it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, and then there's also people saying, yeah, we aren't going to give any money to that. To hell with you, you know. Mm-hmm. You're doing that, you'll have to figure out how to do it yourself, Bernie.
So I have not read the book.
Bernie and then Brian, yeah?
What?
Bernie first and then Brian has his
Okay,
next.
this is Bernie Fisher, I'm in the room. So you're trying to make an impact on Western water policy.
Yes.
And the title of the book says Lessons from Wyoming. And the rest of the West is going to say, oh, that's that little bitty lost state up there in the middle of nowhere. Does that have a negative reach because it's just Wyoming? Whereas if it was lessons from, I'll say even just Colorado, somewhere that people think is a little more important.
Right.
Does that concern you at all in a way? I realize the big title is public waters, but you got Wyoming in the title. I just wonder whether that has an impact.
Well, no, I think it does. And I mean, really, my goal is to affect policy in Wyoming.
Okay.
But I do think that particularly rural places in the West that are more like Wyoming, that there are parts of Colorado like the western slope. And even parts of California, certainly Nevada, Idaho, places that don't have these mega federal projects with these unbelievable things delivering water to San Diego into the Imperial Valley and stuff like that. It's sort of about them. How have these people, and that they have a reservoir of understanding that these are public waters that maybe the metropolitan areas and Imperial Irrigation District could learn something from. But I agree with you, it's a downside, but to pretend, I mean, I really wanted to do this and the only thing I knew was this very in-depth detail. And I felt, I was, when I was in Germany, there were, I was amidst all these PhD students who, maybe had made 3 trips to their study area and they had 4 years to do it. And I just felt like, oh, this is my 40-year project. and that gives a lot of richness to it. And if I had tried to, and there's a lot of books written about Colorado and California water, as we know.
Yeah.
Good,
Read a few.
thank you.
Brian?
Great presentation and hearing about all the kind of creativity in, managing water and so on. My question is kind of about rules and use and what extent and what limited extent people are actually be applying this doctrine of prior appropriation, which kind of relates to what Bill was talking about and people rethinking what they can do to the system. And in relation to Bernie, larger context, as you, Ann, are probably familiar, Emlyn Hall has work like on the Pecos River, New Mexico and Texas. And one of the things I really took away from that is he talks the extent to which when there's a drought, a shortage, people do everything but actually apply a prior appropriation. They try not to call the river. Instead, they do all kinds of negotiations, special arrangements to actually meet needs of a bunch of different stakeholders and are quite creative. And then the even larger context, the Cholera River. It may be that this year you actually finally do impose restrictions according to the compact, from the 20s or whatever. But again, the history is all these things that for California and Arizona doing and getting away with because the upstream states weren't taking their water and so on. Again, there's this kind of doctrine, there are these rules in form, but what they've been doing is very different. So the kind of question is, to what extent, again, in Wyoming, do people actually put prior appropriation into practice, or is it only kind of a point of reference or a small part of something much more complicated and interesting in terms of what people do? Thank you.
Yes, no, you're exactly right. And I probably should have tried to address that, but thank you for bringing it up because I ended up trying to describe it as sort of a net over the state of all these ditches and the way people, and then there's some places that are regulated every year and somebody calls. But a lot of places where they're just working various things out. And this on the Colorado River, that's completely true. I mean, in the last 20 years, the states have been working on delivering water to the ocean and getting water through what used to be a wonderful wetland area where it's been dry for a long time, even as this so-called drought, which is aridification and climate change, has been going on for 20 years. So, and that's all, and I think that's what's going to happen. And there's negotiation right now. They have to come up with new guidelines till 2026. And I think there's, all of those, we're not going to actually, we don't want to go to Congress and change the compact, but we're going to agree to do this. So it's sort of what I was talking about on the tribal example also, is that, okay, we got this court decision, but who wants to live with that? So, but that sort of, what the real rules were, what the rules in use really are is fascinating to watch. And one of the sort of legal people who read it for me was like, yeah, that's the most interesting part, which is, I totally agree with you, is the most interesting part. And I should have said something about it.
I have Michael now, then Jamie, and then I would like to jump in with the question, and most likely we are ready to stop then. Michael.
Yeah,
Go
thanks,
ahead.
Insa. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Like Bill, I'm glad to be participating in the non-academic sort of session, but unfortunately I have to do it remotely for long story. But anyway, this discussion has been fascinating because I think there's a broader lesson in Anne's book, which I've just started reading, and I actually thought her justification for studying Wyoming was quite convincing, because it wasn't just that's what she knew, but because it was an area where the water management hasn't been totally overwhelmed by the complexity and the magnitude of the market and of the big urban areas and national policy. And so you sort of have at this local level where there's this possibility of having these kinds of discussions and re-examining whether what was once waste was once seen as waste, there's now use for it. And if it is a public, who's part of the public? You know, the conservationists caring about the birds are part of it, maybe not the Native Americans, but still working on that. But it's just a fascinating story about how the birds were able to be fit into this system. But I think it also has a lesson for more broadly. Much of the American political discourse has become dominated by an almost religious connection to protection of private property. The vaccines is really the critical thing. You know, I should not have to take a vaccine if I don't want to, even though that if we all did that, that would be good for the public health as a whole. So there's a need, I think, in this country for a re-examination of just where that boundary between public or individual freedom and responsibility for the public lies. And your story fits in there in a particularly important topic for people in Wyoming, not so much as critical in some other areas, at least not yet. But I think there's a broader story there, a narrative there about this public-private sort of connection, and I encourage you to develop that as much as you can.
Can I just offer a quick reaction to that? Because that's a great point, and it's not, and as Mike was pointing out, I mean, Anne's book gets us off to a good start in this way too. It's not as though everybody in Wyoming wakes up every morning and goes, that water is public. That's not how people have internalized that rule.
Right.
And in fact, you can kind of understand in terms of the day-to-day life of a landowner in Wyoming. It's like, well, that land is my land. That livestock is my livestock. You know, that those buildings, you know, my house and my barn, or whatever other facilities I have, those are my buildings. But I shouldn't think of the water I'm using as my water. I mean, it's just, it strains sort of ordinary human cognition to live day to day on the landscape and have it be my land and my animals and my buildings, but it's not my water. And so people develop a sense that they have a private property right to the water also. And the story in Wyoming and the story in other places in the West as well is people have to be sort of dragged back to that recognition and sort of reminded of it, usually in highly conflictual circumstances, to say, yeah, I know you've been using it. I know you've been using it this way for, 3 generations and all that stuff, but it's still actually the public's water, and you have a conditional right of using it. And that's a hard thing for people. People don't walk around with constitutional rules in their heads.
No, but
on a day-to-day basis, they can occasionally have to be brought back to. We all have to be brought back to the realization, what's the deal here?
But and what I tried to demonstrate in there is that people do, and they are brought back to it if they try to make any changes. water is not like land or a house or a cow. I mean, it creates interconnections between people, and they do always know that. I mean, every day they do think about that.
Yeah.
And that's the part that is the reason why there's a public piece to this whole thing, because the whole public is,
They're interdependent.
yeah,
They're interdependent, whether they're fighting or negotiating or
right,
collaborating.
right.
They're
right.
interdependent.
In a way that, you know, I mean, we do have zoning rules for land, you know, somebody else's land use does affect you, but not in a way that their water use or use of the whole goddamn stream affects you. So that part I think is there. I agree that people, you know, need to draw upon that. I mean, I've had situations, major funders on the Colorado River issue say, well, of course, water is a private property right. And you're just like,
Yes.
well, no, actually, that's not the case. And why do you say that?
You hear it all the time.
Yeah.
I hear it all the time.
But to have people who allegedly work in water every day say that, you just feel like, all right.
It's kind of property, right? I mean,
Yeah, but
the
it's,
word property applies to their usus and usus fructus as it did in Roman law.
right.
Right?
Or it's, you know, they definitely have access and use and sometimes some management, but they don't have the whole ball of wax.
Yeah, now we get into property right
Yeah.
debate here.
Yeah.
Yeah, stay tuned. In the second hour, property rights. Anyway, sorry, go ahead. You should go on to Jamie.
Jamie,
Actually,
please yeah.
Yes, of course. This set me up for this question, though. So many of the things that are swirling around the table really make me think, why are we calling this, you know, a public water? Why can't we encode it in the Constitution as a commons property? You know, whereas like Insa, to refer to your example on the first or second day of our IAD class, where you said, you know, we talked about water as this commons until you like take a cup, you pour the water in the cup, and it goes from a common good to like me using it as my private good. Well, why can't our rules reflect the change in the nature of water as in the changing nature of its state as a good?
Well, I guess I think the very in this little obscure location, the structure of the management reflects that, because really, I mean, you cannot move the headgate on your ditch without going to talk to people who only meet 4 times a year. You have to go in front of them. And, you know, sometimes, in fact, you move a ditch and they find out about it next year, but at some point they get you to come in front of them and justify that you moved that thing. And you certainly can't, you know, say, oh, yeah, my neighbor 3 miles away needs it. It's his now. I mean, it's like, whoa, buddy, because when you put that on your land, it will flow back into the river in this way that affect these 6 other people. And if you let him take it, it's going to be this. And so we're there. We're on top of you for that. So anyway, I think and that to me was one of the things that first struck me, because Wyoming is like everybody else and more so now in terms of polarization. You know, we don't believe in government, but we do go see these guys who meet only 4 times a year. And if we want to move our ditch, we have to talk to them. And we think we should talk to them. I mean,
They're not the
what is that?
They're not the government, they're the water board.
They're the water board. Right. Anyway,
sorry.
but I think that is a good question. The language could be better, obviously, but the language dates from more than 100 years ago. Yeah.
And I would like to just come back once to my idea of impact stories. So if
Yes.
you would have started with this book right away in 2005, in what way would it be different from what it is now?
The book or
The
the place?
The book.
I don't
I mean,
understand.
when you came to the workshop first as a visiting
Oh, if I
scholar,
had
you
just
were
tried to-
already
Yes,
ready to write this book, and you started saying, I gave Bill my first chapter.
right.
So, but now there was all this interaction in between with people in this crowd. So
Yeah,
can you grasp that, and how far it might have been different, or what did it add to the way of?
hugely, because my father's sister had thing on her icebox that said, the plural of anecdote is not data. Which is an amazing thing for somebody's but I think I would have written a series of anecdotes, you know,
Mhm.
and instead it be this experience at the workshop and the kind of reading, you know, I could have stayed in Wyoming and I know every water person there and the law school and the blah, blah, blah. But they're all, you know, forest for the trees. They're in the midst of it. So to be able to back off and say, what is going on here? What is really happening with the property rights? Your question. And who is, you know, is it just kind of peculiar that the legislature really doesn't make these decisions, or does it mean something? And so all these, I mean, it made a huge difference in terms of thinking of the structure of what's important to include and what isn't. So I don't, probably the title, I don't know, it might have been more about Elwood himself. And
Who's from where?
who is from Indiana. Thank you, good point. He's from Vevey, Indiana, and he went to Purdue. Yeah.
I'm glad we finally got to the climax.
That's right.
Yeah.
Come on. You buried the lead here.
You're right. And he grew up on the Ohio River, and he would have thought the North Platte was a creek.
Oh, yes, he would.
Oh, so with that, thank you everybody for joining the session. I hope we can get another one impact story talk arranged in the near future. Thanks the audience on Skype and all of those here
Thank
in
you,
the
guys.
room.